They had no word for tsunami, no myths for oceans that rise in fury and erase a kingdom before breath can form a prayer. The Minoans, makers of palaces, painters of dolphins, lived in peace with the sea, until the sea remembered its wrath. One spring morning around 1600 BCE, the earth cracked open at Thera. Ash swallowed the sun, and the sea, miles away, began to recede. Fishermen didn't run. Children watched the horizon shimmer. Then the wave came. Tall as a mountain, fast as thunder, it crossed the Aegean in silence and turned a vibrant world into a whisper. You're safe now, breathe slow, let the past whisper its story to you. The island of Crete, surrounded by the calm Aegean Sea, once cradled a civilization that seemed to move in rhythm with the Earth's gentle pulse. Long before the sound of erupting volcanoes or waves tearing through harbors, there was a world built on grace and seafoam. The Minoans, as they would later be called, did not surround their cities with walls. They placed faith not in battlements or swords, but in trade winds and divine favor. From roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE, they flourished not through conquest, but through art, commerce, and quiet ingenuity. Their palaces rose not as fortresses, but as sprawling, open compounds, flooded with light and painted with life. Knossos, the crown of their architecture, breathed color from its very stones. Frescoes of leaping dolphins danced across plaster walls, their movement frozen mid-joy. In courtyards, athletes practiced bull leaping, a ritual of grace and bravery, perhaps more performance than sport. Everything in the Minoan world felt softened. Even their plumbing, surprisingly advanced, whispered of a people who valued cleanliness and control. They engineered terracotta drainage systems, multi-story living spaces, and storerooms stacked with giant pith jars brimming with olive oil, wine, and grain. There was no sign of monarchy as known elsewhere, no towering statues of warlords, no scribes immortalizing kings by sword or treaty. Instead, their society flowed laterally, not vertically, with priestesses and communal rituals likely guiding their spiritual and civic life. The Minoan religion swirled around female deities, snake goddesses with open arms, standing among lilies and birds. Their pantheon, though lost in name, left impressions in ivory and clay, worshipping fertility, renewal, and the changing seasons. Shrines were often nestled in the natural world, mountaintops, caves, groves, as if the divine lived in wind and stone. In later myths, the Greeks would anchor their own legends here. They told of a labyrinth beneath Knossos, of a minotaur hidden in shadow. But the reality was simpler, and in many ways stranger, a civilization both complex and unguarded, thriving not behind walls, but under the open sky. Daily life moved with the sea. Minoan merchants loaded amphorae onto sleek ships bound for Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia. They traded saffron, honey, wool, and fine ceramics painted with spirals, octopuses, and abstract waves. The sea brought wealth, knowledge, and stories. It was a highway, not a barrier. And so their harbors lay exposed, as did their towns. There were no standing armies, no garrisons in sight. The people lived as if catastrophe were not part of the natural order. Perhaps they had forgotten earlier tremors. Perhaps they believed the gods would shield them from the deep. Children grew up among color. Boys and girls alike wore linen adorned in jewelry. Women held prominent roles in religion, possibly politics. Artisans shaped gold into bees mid-flight. Scribes marked tablets with linear script, still undeciphered, still silent. The rhythm of the year was marked by the earth cycles, planting, harvesting, sailing, honoring the mother goddess. Music likely echoed in festival halls. Wine was poured in libation, not in conquest. Life hummed in ritual, not rule. The absence of war monuments is striking. While other Bronze Age powers celebrated martial victories in stone, the Minoans left no scenes of kings trampling foes. Their art instead featured flora, fauna, and dance. Perhaps this reflected a cultural preference, or perhaps it was a mask, a quiet refusal to glorify violence. Whatever the truth, the archaeological silence is its own kind of presence. It tells of a people who arranged their lives differently, who saw power not in domination, but in flow, of trade, of seasons, of water. Yet beneath this grace, the island was always listening. The earth beneath Crete rests along tectonic fault lines. Earthquakes visited from time to time, their memory etched in cracked walls and rebuilt foundations. But the people returned to the same places, rebuilt the same walls, painted over fractures. There is a gentle stubbornness in that, a belief that beauty could endure, even against the rumble of the earth's deeper moods. In the highlands, shepherds guided goats through olive groves. On terraced slope, farmers tended vines and wheat. In towns, potters turned clay into vessels that told stories without words. At every level of life, the Minoans appeared to be in conversation with their surroundings. Even their architectural layout mirrored natural light and wind patterns. Rooms opened onto courtyards. Staircases spiraled like nautilus shells. Water was guided through hidden channels. Nothing was built to dominate. Everything was built to breathe. It is easy to romanticize this world, and tempting to imagine it as a peaceful idyll. But no civilization is without its hardships. There were likely class differences, labor demands, famines, losses. Yet the traces left behind suggest a society less obsessed with control than with balance. In a time when many civilizations built upward, toward the gods, toward kingship, the Minoans built outward, into the sea, into color, into silence. And so they lived for centuries in a delicate choreography of trust. Trust in nature, trust in continuity, trust in the sea that fed them and framed their myths. There was no sign in those last days that disaster would arrive not from within, but from far across the horizon. There was no reason to suspect that an eruption hundreds of miles away would shatter their trust, break their rhythm, and begin the unraveling of everything they had built. But for now, on the eve of devastation, the island sighed in spring. Olive trees rustled in the wind. Frescoes dried on sunlit walls. A ship returned to harbor, its hull full of copper and saffron. The people moved through their days as they always had, unwalled, unworried, untouched. And the sea, that silent witness, watched and waited. The air is warm on the island of Crete, perfumed with thyme and the distant salt of the sea. The sun is rising over the hills, casting long golden fingers across the walls of a palace that once pulsed with color and movement. Before it was ruin, it was Knossos, a living structure, wide open to the sky. It did not rise like a fortress, but unfolded like a labyrinth of breath and light. Unlike later palaces of kings and empires, Knossos did not intimidate, it welcomed. Its rooms connected in flowing succession, its walls curved, its staircases spiraled like shells from the sea that wrapped its shores. There were no towering statues of war gods or displays of violence carved in stone. Instead, the walls bore scenes of marine life, dolphins in motion, octopuses curling, lilies swaying. The frescoes, painted with mineral pigments on wet plaster, preserved not just images, but moods. The blues were deep and soothing. The reds, sun-warmed and alive. In one room, a boy carries saffron crocuses in a delicate gesture. In another, a priestess with bare shoulders and layered skirts holds serpents in both hands, her gaze unwavering. These were not pictures of domination. They were celebrations of balance, of coexistence, of the fragile strength found in nature and ritual. Beneath the palace ran an intricate system of pipes and drains, clay channels that carried fresh water in and waste out. The Minoans mastered indoor plumbing long before Rome. Rainwater was captured from rooftops, channeled down terracotta pipes, and guided into storage cisterns. In hot summer months, water still flowed through stone-cut channels that cooled the halls. Even the latrines had careful engineering. This was not luxury for its own sake, but a design in harmony with the rhythms of living, a small defiance against chaos. The palace had no grand central throne room in the way one might expect. There were chambers, yes, where leaders and priestesses gathered, but power was not shouted from high platforms. It moved more like a dance. The architecture reflected this: multi-storied spaces, wide courtyards, airy colonnades. Light wells opened into deep inner rooms. Daylight poured in from above, never needing to force its way. Some believe Knossos was designed less to command and more to guide the senses, encouraging movement, reflection, and ceremony. In the central court, rituals unfolded. Bull leaping, depicted often in the art, was more than a spectacle. Young athletes, male and female, would grasp the horns of a charging bull, vault into the air, and land gracefully behind it. Whether it was religious, performative, or symbolic remains debated, but it was real. Bones confirm bulls were kept and honored here. The bull was sacred, not as a beast of burden, but as a creature between worlds, feared and revered. The echoes of its hooves may still rest in the dust. Offerings were made in shrines tucked into the palace's corners. Clay tablets inscribed in linear are recorded inventories and dedications. Tiny figurines stood silent on stone altars, women with uplifted arms, animals in repose, miniature tripods. The rituals were tactile. Objects mattered. Wine poured onto earth, honey left in bowls, flowers arranged beside horns. It wasn't grandeur that defined Knossos, but attention to color, gesture, and sacred repetition. Servants and artisans moved through hidden corridors, ferrying food, pigment, cloth. Their hands stirred the daily life of the palace. The kitchens, far from grand, were efficient: low basins, clay ovens, stone counters worn by use. In storerooms, enormous jars held olive oil, grain, and wine. Some stood as tall as a man. Their curved sides bore simple markings, scratched records of contents and ownership. These were the lungs of the palace, feeding bodies and rituals alike. Outside, gardens framed the terraces. Paved walkways led to satellite buildings and workshops. There was weaving, metalwork, and the shaping of ivory and gold. Craftsmen carved seal stones with minute images: a bull, a wave, a ship. These were not mass-produced symbols of empire. Each one was its own world, its own identity, pressed into wet clay like a soft declaration of presence. Trade goods flowed in from distant lands. From Egypt came scarabs and ostrich eggs. From Anatolia, copper. From the Cyclades, obsidian. Knossos was not isolated. It was a hub, a soft-spoken capital of a sea-bound network. The people who moved through Knossos did not all share equal privilege. Some labored unseen, grinding grain, cleaning drains, weaving cloth into temple offerings. Yet the art suggests an unusual fluidity. Women appear not just as mothers or mourners, but as officiants, dancers, and participants in civic life. Their presence is firm and unhidden, braided into the palace's daily texture. The architecture itself mirrors this. Spaces are not segmented by aggression or exclusion, but by flow. There is a quiet irony here in how the palace was both grand and vulnerable. Its walls were painted but thin. Its floors were paved but unarmored. No battlements, no moat, no defensive towers. The confidence was architectural in design, not defense. Knossos stood unguarded in a world that would not remain gentle. Perhaps they believed the gods would shelter them, or that diplomacy and wealth offered their own kind of armor. Or perhaps they never imagined that catastrophe could arrive from the sea, or from fire beneath the earth. Over time, the palace was rebuilt again and again after fires and tremors. each reconstruction layered on the old. Some rooms bear traces of earlier frescoes beneath newer coats. The complex evolved not as a monument to permanence, but as a palimpsest, a story written over and over with memory barely erased. And yet, after the final devastation, it was left to silence. Its rooms collapsed. Ash and time sealed its courtyards. Later generations forgot the names spoken in its halls. When modern archaeologists unearthed Knossos, they found not just walls but moments. A wooden beam charred but still intact, a fresco fragment with the corner of a dolphin's fin, a pot overturned beside a doorframe. These are the quiet echoes that remain, not proclamations but remnants. The palace did not preserve history as kings and generals do in monuments and battle records. It left something softer, a rhythm, a sense of space, a breath caught in clay. Today, the ruins lie exposed under Mediterranean sun. The reconstructed columns, painted red and black, rise from foundations worn by centuries. Visitors walk where priestesses once passed, where dancers once took flight. The frescoes are copies now. The wind moves through open rooms where no one speaks. And yet, even in silence, the shape of the old palace remains not as ruin alone, but as a memory of a world that chose light over fear, flow over force, grace over command. Knossos did not fall all at once, but something changed. The tremors became more frequent, the seas less predictable. The networks that once tied Crete to the world began to loosen, and the palace slowly slipped from ritual into memory. Yet for a time, it stood vibrant, strange, and almost weightless, a place that breathed with the rhythm of a people who built not to intimidate, but to belong. In the southern Aegean Sea, wrapped in sunlight and wind, the island of Thera once slept beneath groves of olive trees and quiet villages. Its slopes were gentle, its fields dotted with poppies in spring. From a distance, it looked like a crescent moon cradling the sea, a place of calm, perched between sky and water. The people who lived there planted barley, raised goats, traded obsidian, and crafted pottery with curling motifs. Their walls were painted with saffron gatherers and blue monkeys, parrots and ships. The island seemed still, a gentle link in the chain of cyclodic islands that watched over the sea lanes between Crete and the mainland. But beneath the soil, beneath the painted walls and open hearths, something vast and silent waited. Thera, known today as Santorini, is not simply an island, but the rim of a caldera, the broken lip of a volcano that once shaped not only the land, but the course of civilizations. It is hard to imagine, standing in the blue haze of its CL, ifs that its story is one of fire, yet traces remain not in legend alone, but in ash, in stone, in the gaps of memory that geology slowly fills. The volcano had long been part of the island's life. Steam vents whispered from fissures. Minor quakes shifted ground. Perhaps some villages were rebuilt more often than others. But to those who lived there around 1600 BCE, the mountain gave no clear warning. Its silence was older than their memory. Modern scientists trace its breath in layers. Beneath the vineyards, in slices of pale earth, lie bands of pumice and ash, thick, gray, glassy. These are not remnants of surface fires, but deep core evidence of eruption. The Minoan eruption, as it is now called, was one of the largest the world has known, a Plinian event, named after the Roman writer who described Vesuvius. It expelled an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material. Entire sections of the island collapsed into the sea. The blast was likely 4 times greater than Krakatoa, and its echoes reached distant shores, carried by wind, by water, by rumor. But before all that, there was stillness. The town of Akrotiri, buried and preserved, shows no sign of panic. No bodies were found in the ash. The houses, made of stone and timber, were orderly. Storage jars stood sealed. Beds were empty. It is possible the people had time to flee, perhaps warned by tremors or a smaller eruption days before, but the volcano gave few clues in advance. When it awoke, it did so in stages. First came the earthquakes. For weeks, maybe longer, the island shook underfoot. Roads cracked, wells dried. Pottery fell from shelves. Still, life went on. People in earthquake-prone regions learned to wait things out. They rebuild, they adapt, and Thera had likely trembled before. Then came the explosion, not all at once, but in pulses. The magma chamber, long under pressure, fractured the surface. A column of ash and rock rose miles into the sky. Pyroclastic flows, searing gas and debris, tore down the slopes, moving faster than sound. These flows did not burn what they touched, they vaporized it. The sky darkened, day turned to dusk. Ash spread east, covering parts of Crete, settling over fields, poisoning water. For days, perhaps weeks, the eruption continued. In its final act, the caldera collapsed inward. The center of the island fell into itself. Seawater rushed in, hissing into the magma below. What followed was not only a geological event, but a chain of consequences stretching across the Bronze Age. The tsunami it triggered may have reached Crete's northern coast, devastating Minoan ports and villages. Trade halted. Crops failed in nearby regions. Even Egypt, far to the south, recorded strange red skies and disturbances in their annals. Some historians suggest that the chaos helped tip the balance of power in the region, weakening the Minoans, emboldening the Mycenaeans. But here, in this chapter of ash and silence, we linger not on consequence, but on origin, on the sleeping monster beneath beauty. The island's name, Thera, comes from later Greek settlers. In the Bronze Age, it may have had another name lost now. Akrotiri, the best preserved town, was advanced by any measure. Multi-story buildings, frescoed walls, stone-paved streets, drainage systems. The art shows life not as a struggle, but a celebration. There are no war scenes, no kings seated on thrones, only rituals, ships, flowers, animals. This absence speaks. The volcano did not destroy a world bent on conquest, but one invested in grace. And so the tragedy deepens. Even myths seem to remember. Centuries later, Plato wrote of a great island swallowed by the sea. Atlantis, he called it, an echo perhaps of the Minoans of Thera, of something once luminous and now buried. While scholars debate the link, the timing is haunting. A civilization lost to waves, a memory distorted by time but anchored in catastrophe. The caldera that remains is a quiet witness. The cliffs, rising hundreds of meters, show the strata of the blast, white, red, black. Tourists gaze from balconies at sunsets reflected in the sea-filled basin, unaware they stand on a broken rim of fire. Boats drift across what was once the center of the island, now a flooded void. In the middle rises Nikamni, a newer volcanic islet, still warm, still active. The earth here has not finished its story. Ash from the eruption lies buried as far as Asia Minor. In ice cores from Greenland, scientists detect chemical traces of the sulfur clouds it produced. Even today, models of global climate suggest that the eruption led to a temporary drop in temperatures, a volcanic winter. Crops would have failed, famines would have spread, and yet it all began in a place of peace, under olive trees and clear skies. There's something gently cruel in how the most beautiful places often hold the deepest scars. Thera is shaped like a smile, but its history is hollowed by absence. A civilization advanced in art and ritual, endown not by war, but by a mountain's long silence breaking open. And even now it sleeps again. The volcano still breathes faintly. In 1950, it erupted once more, a minor episode, steam and lava forming new land. Scientists watch, monitor, measure. But the Earth does not rush. Its movements stretch across lifetimes. Perhaps the people of ancient Thera felt tremors in their bones in their sleep. Perhaps they sensed the unease of soil and sky, but there is no record of their fear. Only the layers of ash, the frozen staircases, the rooms left waiting. The sleeping volcano took its time, gave no warning that would be remembered, and when it finally spoke, it did not roar. It buried, it erased, it silenced, and from that silence we begin to listen. In the volcanic rock of Santorini, vines grow strong. The soil, porous and rich in minerals, clings to water. Wine made here tastes of stone and salt, of heat and root. Life has returned, shaped by what was lost. But beneath the terraces, beneath the earth, the ancient ash still waits, sealing stories that once breathed above ground. Not in legend, not in song, but in stone. And so Thera rests again, quiet and sunlit. The sea laps gently at the cliffs. Wind moves through the grasses. The volcano sleeps as it did before. But the memory of its waking never fully fades. It lingers not in fear, but in the shape of the island, in the curve of the caldera, in the knowledge that beauty often grows from ruins, and that some disasters begin not with thunder, but with stillness. The day begins as it always had on Thera. A warm wind rustles the barley fields. The sea, tucked neatly into the horizon, breathes slow against the shore. Villagers stir in their homes, sweep their courtyards, begin to heat water. Goats bleat softly in the hills, and the scent of fig and wood smoke floats in the still air. Everything moves with the same rhythm it has for generations. There is no word for what is about to begin. No warning etched in the rhythm of morning routines. But far below, the earth is shifting. It starts with a deep sound, too low to name. A pressure building, then releasing, then building again. At first, it feels like wind in the bones or water behind the eyes, a sensation more than a sound. Then the rumble rises gently at first, like a cart rolling over loose stones. People pause, glance up, then return to their tasks. Thera has shaken before. It is not unusual for the earth to sigh here. The first tremor passes quickly. Dust stirs in the corners of doorways. A hanging oil lamp swings. Then silence returns, deeper now, as if the earth is holding its breath. In the following days, the shaking grows more persistent. Floors ripple, clay jars topple from shelves. At Crete, stones fall from walls built with careful hands. Cracks appear in the paved streets, thin and shallow like hairline fractures in old pottery. Residents begin to repair what they can, stacking fallen bricks, patching corners, sweeping ash from ledges. But the repairs feel different this time. Less hopeful. More like gestures made for the sake of order rather than belief. Animals are often the first to stop trusting the ground. Dogs grow restless. Birds vanish from the hills. Goats press themselves into corners, refusing to eat. Farmers watch the sky, not out of superstition, but because they don't know where else to look. Then the sound returns, louder now. It is not just beneath the feet, but in the chest. It hums behind the ears, interrupts conversations, folds into sleep. Some say it comes from the mountain, though the mountain still looks the same. Its slopes are quiet, dusted with spring flowers. The olive trees do not speak. And yet something is no longer right. Days turn to weeks. More tremors come, uneven and sharp. At night, families sleep outside. They leave doors unlatched. Their footsteps become lighter. When a larger shock rips through the island, some begin to leave. Traders pack their goods. Boats fill the harbors bound for nearby islands. Still, many remain. Where else is there to go? The priests continue their rituals, offering prayers to the gods of earth and sky. They burn sweet herbs in shallow basins and pour wine into the soil. But the soil no longer listens. Then, without further warning, the volcano speaks. The eruption begins not with a roar, but a crack. A column of steam and ash shoots into the air from a vent on the northern slope. The sky above it goes white, not with clouds, but with something heavier, something that stays. People in Crete gather in the streets, staring upward. Ash falls lightly, floating like snow. Children reach out to catch it. At first, it is cool to the touch. Soft, gray, oddly beautiful. Then it thickens. It clings to roofs, to hair, to breath. The sky darkens to an amber hue, and the air takes on the taste of metal. Farmers abandon their tools in the fields. Fishermen run to secure boats, though many are already gone. The island becomes muffled. Ed as though padded in silence, though the mountain is no longer quiet. The next phase comes fast. A new vent opens, releasing gases and molten rock. The plume climbs higher, over 30 kilometers into the atmosphere. Thunder claps without storm. Lightning dances inside the ash cloud. The wind shifts. Fine particles spread across the Aegean, reaching other islands, drifting east toward Anatolia, southeast toward Crete. On Thera, breathing grows difficult. Eyes water. Pots are overturned to cover wells. People wet cloths and tie them over their faces. It is no longer a question of whether to leave, but whether one can. Geologists today call this phase Plinian, explosive, vertical, relentless. Ash layers found centuries later measure meters thick. Entire structures were buried while still standing. But in those hours, none of that is known. There is only the sensation of everything disintegrating, not just homes and streets, but time. Each moment blurs into the next. Sight narrows to hands, feet, breath. Some make it to boats, others do not. At Akrotiri, the streets are empty. No remains are found in the ash, suggesting they fled before the final collapse. A small mercy in a slow disaster. Then the pyroclastic flows begin. Waves of superheated gas and debris surge down the slopes. They move faster than horses, faster than wind. These flows are not like fire. They do not burn, they obliterate. Buildings vanish in seconds. Trees vanish. The sea sizzles at the touch. A surge crashes into the harbor, pushing water inland before retreating in silence. The final phase of the eruption reshapes the island entirely. As the magma chamber empties, the center of Thera collapses inward. Land caves into itself. What was once solid becomes void. Seawater rushes in, mixing with molten rock, releasing a new surge of steam and fury. The caldera forms, a wound in the earth that will one day be mistaken for a bay. Out at sea, the tsunami begins to build. It is born not in wind or storm, but in sudden absence. Where land once was, there is now depth. The sea draws back, then surges forward. The waves are said to have reached 15 meters high, striking Crete's northern coast hours later. Ports disappear. Ships are hurled inland. Coastal villages drown. The Minoan world, once defined by its relationship with the sea, is left fractured and silent. But back on Thera, the eruption slows. The sky remains dark for days. Ash continues to fall, covering the island in layers that will preserve it for millennia. The winds carry particles across the region. Ice core samples from Greenland will one day record this moment in sulfur and soot. Crops fail in Egypt. Climate shifts. And yet, for all its power, the eruption leaves no written record. Only later in myth and memory will whispers return. Of islands swallowed by the sea. Of gods punishing hubris. Of civilizations lost beneath ash and time. But on Thera, the silence remains. When modern archaeologists excavate Akrotiri, they will find walls still painted with blue monkeys and women harvesting crocus. Furniture in place, jars still sealed, as if life paused mid-breath. There are no skeletons, no screams frozen in plaster, only empty rooms and stairs that lead to nowhere. And perhaps that's what lingers most, the quiet precision of what was left behind. The ordinary objects of a world undone, caught in its final moments not by fire, but by time itself. The eruption has ended. The mountain rests once more, but the shape of Thera has changed. Its center, once full, is now sea. Its memory, once spoken, is now buried. and the people who watched the sky change color, who felt the ground ripple beneath their feet, who caught ash like snow in the palms of their hands, they are gone. Only the island remains, folded in on itself, waiting for someone to ask what happened here. What began with rumbling ended not with sound, but with stillness. A silence thick enough to last centuries. A pause that stretches across history, gentle and unspoken. In the months that followed the eruption of Thera, the sky changed first. Not in sudden, violent strokes, but in quiet drift. The ash plume, now detached from its source, traveled on high-altitude winds. It moved east, then south, then wider still. Invisible to those who felt its earliest reach, the air grew heavier. The color of the sky dimmed not to night, but to a strange pale dusk that lingered through midday. The sun, when it appeared, seemed diluted, its light filtered through a gray veil. Shadows grew softer, but also longer. It was a change people noticed only slowly, until they could no longer recall when the brightness had gone. On Crete, the olive harvest began late. The trees had bloomed early that year, but the flowers fell too soon. In the northern valleys, barley sprouted but yellowed before its time. Fishermen returned with lighter nets. The water, once clear, now shimmered with unfamiliar particles. No storm had passed. No war had been declared, but something was wrong. Further inland, in Anatolia and the Levant, the symptoms multiplied. Birds migrated early. Herd animals grew lean, their grazing grounds patchy and brittle. Goatherds spoke of illness among the flocks, of stillbirths and quiet disappearances. The fields bore fewer grains, and those that did survive were small, hard, bitter. When the rains came, they came late, and then too much at once. Floods washed over already weakened soil. In Egypt, scribes began to record anomalies: red-hued sunsets, unusual haze, low river levels. The Nile, so often predictable, shifted its temperament. None of these signs pointed clearly to the volcano. There were no ash-streaked scrolls, no direct records of falling soot or booming skies in these distant lands. And yet, science would later trace it backward, through ice cores drilled from Greenland's frozen silence, through lake beds in Turkey, through tree rings that narrowed in quiet protest. The sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere by Thera's eruption had spread across hemispheres. It scattered sunlight, reduced temperatures, interrupted rainfall. It was not a catastrophe in a single blow, but a dimming, slow, cold, and indifferent. Historians call this phenomenon volcanic winter. A misnomer, perhaps, because winter implies a season with an end. This was more like an echo that refused to stop ringing. A drop in global temperature by just a degree or two may seem small, but to an agrarian society, it is a death by inches. Crops do not ripen. Animals wander farther. People begin to ration without understanding why. Trade falters. Markets shrink. Coin loses value when there is no grain to buy. In palace storerooms, granaries were sealed tighter. In the villages, porridge grew thinner. Children were sent to live with extended family. Offerings to the gods increased, not because belief had grown, but because fear had. The sun, once worshipped as giver of all things, now appeared distant and silent. Temples lit more fires, burned more incense, chanted longer into dusk. But the gods did not reply. They were quiet or absent or changed. Far from Thera's crater, people lived as they always had, turning soil, binding reeds, trading with neighbors. But each season arrived with less promise. In Cyprus, the copper trade slowed. In Ugarit, shipping logs grew sparse. On the Aegean islands, the ceramic styles changed, a quiet shift in decoration that hinted at deeper unrest. In the absence of food security, people turn inward. Art retreats. Walls go unpainted. Records stop mid-sentence. The volcanic ash did not need to reach every field to do its work. It hovered in the stratosphere, cloaking the earth in a fine gray shawl. Photosynthesis declined. Trees bore fewer fruits. Insects changed their migration, and the people, those least able to observe the science of it, responded in the ways that humans always have, with worry, with adjustment, with endurance, and sometimes with despair. The social fabric frays gently in such times. Tensions increase between neighboring regions. Tribute is delayed. Borders become brittle. In some cities, religious orders grew more powerful as fear turned to ritual. In others, old alliances dissolved without violence, undone by scarcity, not war. The collapse was not explosive, but intimate. A slow rearrangement of expectations. A hollowing of trust in the cycles of sun and soil. Modern researchers have debated the scale of Thera's climatic impact, but the circumstantial threads are strong. A notable cooling around 1600 BCE. Failed harvests. Political instability in parts of Mesopotamia. Delayed monsoons in regions as far as the Indian subcontinent. It may not have caused collapse alone, but it weakened systems already strained, tipping balance in favor of chaos. And yet, even in hardship, life did not vanish. People adapted. They planted shorter season crops. They stored roots instead of grains. They traveled farther for trade. They passed down stories of the years when the sun forgot to shine. Some believed it was punishment, others a test. Most simply carried on tightening belts, mending roofs, placing faith in the next season, then the next. There is a kind of disaster that shouts fire, flood, war. And then there is the kind that whispers dim skies, spoiled grain, the slow withering of certainty. The eruption of Thera was both. A thunderous moment on one island and a quiet unraveling across many. In time, the ash settled. The atmosphere cleared. The sun returned to its full brightness, though it seemed brighter than before, like waking from a long dream. But the memory lingered, tucked into layers of sediment and the gaps between kings in lineage charts. In Crete, the Minoan civilization, already shaken by waves and quakes, began to recede. In other regions, new powers emerged, shaped by the lessons of scarcity. A generation grew up knowing only caution. And the volcano, having spoken, went silent ag. Ain, its fury had reshaped the land and darkened the skies. But its echo reshaped lives, not through flame, but through shadow. In the end, it wasn't the ash that was remembered. It was what the ash took with it. The trust in seasons, the predictability of light, the calm rhythm of enough. And in some quiet part of the world, a farmer would lift his eyes to a still darkened sky, wondering when the sun would return, and whether, next time, the earth would give warning. In the quiet after the eruption's fiercest roar, a deeper shift began, not in the sky, but far below, where the sea meets the hidden contours of earth. What had been land was now broken. The caldera beneath Thera had collapsed inward, a vast, yawning wound in the crust of the earth. Magma chambers drained. The island's center fell away. And in its place, water rushed with instinctive force, drawn into the vacuum, colder than the fire it replaced. But this was only part of the story. Just beyond the rim of the island, a massive undersea landslide unfolded in near silence. Triggered by the collapse of the volcanic cone, the seafloor gave way. Rock and sediment that had once rested for centuries now tumbled in an instant. It moved fast, sliding downward into the abyss. Billions of tons of material slipped all at once, reshaping the terrain where none could see. This sudden displacement of mass pushed the sea upward, forcing columns of water skyward, rippling outward in concentric rings. There was no wall of water, not yet. At first, the surface barely seemed disturbed, but beneath it, the ocean was changing shape. This is how a tsunami begins, not with thunder, but with the shifting of worlds. The energy released from the collapse moved outward, carried not by sound or flame, but by the motion of water itself. These waves are not like wind-borne waves. They do not crest and curl. They travel through the entire body of the ocean from surface to seafloor. In deep water, they can pass unnoticed, a rise of only a meter or two, stretched across kilometers. But they carry force, speed, and silence. Moving as fast as a jet plane, they glide across the Aegean basin, bearing no scent, no sound, no shadow. The people who lived along the coastlines of Crete did not know of subduction zones or landslides. They had no word for tsunami. Their language had no shape for this kind of wave, one not born of storm, but of earth. To them, the sea was friend, pathway, provider. It shimmered in their frescoes. It rocked their children to sleep. It was not something to fear. When the first sign arrived, it may have seemed like a gift. The waters pulled back from the shore. Across the harbors of northern Crete, the tide dropped rapidly. Boats tilted. Fish flopped in the shallows. Seabed stones glistened in sunlight. Children pointed. Elders watched, puzzled but not alarmed. There was no frame of reference. The sea had never behaved this way before. It was not loud. There was no roar, only an absence of motion, of depth, of warning. Modern scientists have modeled the size and scope of the Thera-generated tsunami. While estimates vary, the waves may have reached heights of 10 to 15 meters by the time they struck the coast of Crete. Some suggest a series of waves, separated by minutes or hours. Others describe a single massive surge, but all agree on one detail: it happened without understanding. There were no sirens, no chance to flee. No one expected the sea to change its nature. The wave, once formed, approached with terrifying grace. In open water, it moved invisibly fast, but as it reached shallower coastal areas, it began to transform. Slowed by the rising seafloor, the wave rose in height, compressed in length, and gathered mass. It became not a wave, but a wall, and then it arrived. Villages near the coast were erased. Homes built with stone and timber stood no chance. Warehouses, shrines, boats, livestock, all carried inland or dragged out to sea. The wave swept through courtyards, marketplaces, olive groves. It reached deep into the mouths of rivers, climbed low hills, filled every hollow it passed. People who had moments before watched the sea disappear were now caught in its return. The force was not constant, but pulsing, a rush, a pause, another surge. Structures collapsed. Soil was stripped. Fires were extinguished mid-flame. On Crete, the Minoans had long lived in harmony with the sea. Their greatest palaces, Knossos, Malia, Phaistos, sat slightly inland, spared from the direct impact. But their lifeblood pulsed through the ports, Amnisos, Kamos, and others that no longer remain. These low-lying hubs were where trade flowed, where boats were repaired, where messages arrived and cargo was counted. The tsunami didn't just shatter buildings. It severed connections. It scattered goods. It drowned memory. Archaeological evidence of the tsunami is found in strange places, layers of sand and marine debris where none should be. In Amnisos, thick silt be. Lankets once inhabited rooms. At Palecastro, pottery shards lie in unnatural jumbles, covered by sea sand. Pollen studies reveal sudden changes, freshwater plants giving way to salt-loving species. There are places where the earth tells a story louder than the ruins ever could. The Minoans likely responded as any people would, first with disbelief, then with ritual. Bodies were buried, shrines rebuilt, offerings increased, but the wave left more than damage. It left confusion. The sea, once sacred, had betrayed them, and yet there was no enemy, no battle, no fault, just a quiet violence from below. In time, the coastlines changed. Harbors silted, shorelines shifted, trade routes had to be reconsidered. Rebuilding was possible, but not simple. The tsunami was not the end of the Minoans, but it was a fracture. A blow from which the civilization would not fully recover. Crops still grew. Palaces still functioned. But something essential had been lost, a rhythm, a trust, a stability. And the wave kept going. Its force did not stop at Crete. It moved onward perhaps to Rhodes, to the coast of Anatolia, even to Cyprus. Every island it touched felt something, perhaps not devastation but disruption. Ports flooded, markets delayed, sailors lost. Word spread as it always does after disaster, but without a full understanding. The cause, buried deep undersea, born of fire and collapse, remained unknowable. Tsunamis do not announce themselves. They do not thunder until the moment of contact. And in the Bronze Age world, where meaning was sought in patterns and gods, this kind of calamity had no language. The wave did not fit into stories of punishment or war. It was a contradiction, an enemy without a face, a ruin without flame. And yet it became part of the memory. Perhaps it was remembered as a curse. Perhaps it became folded into myth, reshaped as metaphor. A sea goddess scorned, a divine test failed. Later civilizations would develop words for it. But in that moment, it was just water, unstoppable, indifferent, and terrifyingly quiet. Today, we map the tectonic faults and model the probabilities. We send warnings through satellites, build sea walls, teach escape routes. But the nature of the tsunami has not changed. It still begins in silence. It still travels faster than we expect. It still carries the weight of continents in its curl. And when it comes, it does not shout. It simply arrives. The wave that followed Thera's collapse may have taken less than an hour to reach Crete. But its effects rippled through decades. It reshaped shorelines and psyches. It challenged a civilization built on openness, grace, and trade. It did not destroy everything, but it took just enough. And now, centuries later, we remember it not through records, but through gaps in walls, in pottery, in soil. The tsunami itself left no words, only absence, only change, only silence. It begins with a silence so strange that even the animals notice. On the northern coast of Crete, where the waves usually lap in rhythmic whispers and fishermen call to one another across the early morning breeze, the sea simply stops. There is no crash, no cry, no stirring of foam against rock. The tide, known and trusted, slips away without a sound. At first, no one panics. There is only wonder. The shoreline, long familiar, seems to stretch. The sea pulls back farther than it ever has. Small fish writhe on the exposed seabed, glittering like coins in the light. Crabs scurry over mudflats. Shells lie open, half buried in the sand. Children laugh as they run barefoot over the strange new ground, gathering treasures too slippery to hold. They chase the last puddles as they shrink beneath the sun. The adults watch from a distance. Some frown, others shrug. This is unusual, yes, but the sea has moods. Perhaps it is a seasonal quirk, a shifting of the tides, a sign from Poseidon. No one has seen anything quite like it, but there is no warning, no word for what is coming. The fishermen walk out to recover beached boats, to mend nets now resting awkwardly on dry ground. They step carefully across terrain the sea had hidden for generations. There is no wind. Even the gulls are quiet. The stillness lingers. Then a faint vibration, barely more than a breath, moves through the ground. A tremor, soft and strange. Amphorae rattle in storerooms, water in clay jugs ripples. It is enough to be felt but not feared. Earthquakes are part of life on these islands. The Cretans have seen stronger ones. They rebuild, they pray, they move on. But today the unease does not pass. It settles, thick and invisible, over the harbor towns and fishing coves. The villagers look to the sea again. The horizon has changed. It now appears as a thin, dark line far away, too straight, too still. No ships move across it. The sea, once a living thing, has become a mirror with no reflection. There is a moment, long and slow, where nothing moves. The air is heavy. The colors are too bright. GHT, even the waves that should be returning do not come. Tsunami survivors across the centuries describe this same sensation. The eerie calm before the wave, the water vanishing, the light growing strange. In later records, they speak of animals fleeing inland, of birds falling silent, of a smell metallic, earthy, unfamiliar. In Crete, no one has these words. There is only instinct. A fisherman calls out. A mother gathers her children. But the beach is still filled with the curious and the unaware. Some linger, pointing. Others begin to walk back up the path, their arms full of sea life that will never be cooked. Then the sea returns. Not gently, not with a rising tide, but as a roar that has been building far away. At first it is sound, not sight. A low rumble deeper than thunder reaches the shore. The ground trembles again. This time it does not stop. People turn toward the horizon and see what looks like a line of cloud moving impossibly fast. It is not a wave in the way one imagines. It is a wall. A moving wall of water and debris, taller than trees, wide as the sky. It is coming too quickly for thought, too fast for flight. The children drop what they've gathered. Some scream, others freeze, adults shout, a few run. But the wave is faster than the body's fear, faster than the mind can calculate. It slams into the shore with ancient force. Boats are lifted like leaves. Stone walls crumble. Olive trees bow and snap. People disappear not into the water, but into force, into weight, into chaos. The water does not stop at the shoreline. It races inland, swallowing streets and plazas, flooding cisterns, tearing through storerooms and markets. Animals cry. Doors burst open. Candles flicker and vanish. In low-lying settlements, homes are ripped from foundations. At higher elevations, survivors watch helplessly, the sound rising like 1,000 hammers striking all at once. And then, like breath held too long, the wave recedes. It does not return to the sea quietly. It drags everything it can. Wood, stone, people, animals, pots, cloth, drawn backward in a churning slurry of broken things. Entire livelihoods vanish in minutes. The land is not what it was. It is changed, gouged, soaked, strewn with what had once been private and precious. But before all of this, before the roar and the ruin, there was that moment. The strange vanishing of the sea, the shimmer of the exposed seabed, the laughter of children collecting fish. It is a moment captured in memory not because of what it was, but because of what followed. A moment described in dozens of tsunami records across time and geography, from Japan to Lisbon, from Samoa to Sicily. The sea pulls back, and the people walk forward, unaware they are moving toward history's edge. In the centuries that follow, stories will be told in fragments. Of a day the tide never returned, of villages swallowed, of coastal towns where silence fell too suddenly. Archaeologists will dig through layers of sediment and find marine deposits above buried walls. They will lift sand-encrusted pottery from beneath collapsed homes. And still, the question will echo, did they know? Did they understand what it meant when the sea vanished? They did not. Tsunamis, as a concept, had not yet entered human language. The link between earthquake and wave was still centuries away from being recorded. To the people of Bronze Age Crete, the sea was life, not threat. Its retreat was curious, not terrifying. Its return was unthinkable. And yet the pattern has repeated. Time and again, across continents, the sea has withdrawn before it strikes. The signs were there, but meaning only arrives after loss. In that way, Crete's northern shore joins a long, quiet lineage of coasts transformed by absence, then by force. What remains in the end is the memory of stillness. The too quiet beach, the silver glint of fish on unfamiliar ground, the weight of air just before it moves, and the understanding now written into geology, into myth, into the logic of science, that the sea, when it recedes, is not retreating. It is gathering, it is remembering, it is about to speak. The wind had stilled, but no one noticed. On the northern coast of Crete, just beyond the lip of a low cliff where tamarisk trees swayed in the mornings and goats gathered in the afternoons, the village continued its day. Built of clay and stone, with walls whitewashed under a sun that had always risen faithfully over the sea, the settlement had stood for generations. Terraces faced the water. Pots sat open in doorways. A few girls cleaned lentils in a shallow basket, while a boy chased chickens with more enthusiasm than skill. In the small courtyard beside the temple, a priest bent over an offering bowl, placing olive leaves carefully on smooth, warm stone. It was late morning. The sea, which had earlier drawn back in a strange, teasing way, was now out of view. What had begun as curiosity, the strange stillness, the bare seabed, the shimmer of straw, and dead fish had started to feel unfamiliar. But there was no word for alarm yet. The elders had not fled. No one shouted. The air felt too dry, the silence too complete. A strange heat pressed down from the sky, not from the sun, but from somewhere else. The horizon was not what it had been. And then the wave came. Not like water, but like something solid. It did not curl or crash. It rose. It surged forward in a wall of sound and force, bearing not just water, but trees, stones, shattered hulls, and silence torn open. It was not blue. It was gray, green, brown, mud and foam and ruin. It struck with no warning and no chance to understand. The sea re-entered the world all at once, as if it had forgotten to wait for permission. The wave hit the harbor first. Boats that had once bobbed gently under the watchful eye of the dockmaster were lifted like leaves, then hurled inland. The ropes that tethered them snapped as if they had never existed. Some vessels shattered against stone. Others simply vanished beneath the weight of water and debris. Crates of oil, amphorae of wine, woven baskets of dried fish, all swept up and pulled apart. The wave had mass, and it moved with memory. In the village, the first sound was not the crash. It was the sudden end of all other sounds. Then a single deep crack, as if the world itself had split open. Stone walls, never meant to resist such force, collapsed inward. Roofs buckled. Beams snapped. A storage shed crumpled like paper, its contents, grain, tools, dried herbs, caught in a whirl of motion and water. The wave did not discriminate. It moved through thresholds, over thresholds, under doors, and into homes with the indifference of nature unrestrained. People tried to run, but the wave was faster. A man carrying a basket turned to flee and was lifted before he could take a second step. A woman clutching a child disappeared behind a broken pillar. Some reached higher ground, but even there, the wave's hand stretched further than anyone believed it could. A small altar toppled in the temple courtyard, its oil lamps extinguished mid-flame. The carved horns of consecration were torn from their base and carried away like driftwood. Wall paintings of dolphins and lilies disintegrated as salt water rushed over lime plaster. Inside a workshop, rows of pottery in various stages of completion, some drying, some fired, some newly painted, shattered against each other in a long, underwater silence. Clay dust mixed with seawater. Brushes floated, tangled in pigment. The apprentice who had set them out that morning was gone, his place marked only by the absence of shape. The force of the wave did not pass in a single blow. It surged, withdrew, and surged again, each time carrying more than it left behind. With each retreat, it dragged pieces of the village back toward the sea, not just objects, but earth itself. Stones that had once been foundations slid away. Trees that had shaded courtyards were uprooted and twisted. The paths between buildings dissolved. Where there had once been order, plazas, steps, hearths, there was now churned mud, shards of pottery, tangled thatch, and silence. Archaeologists centuries later would find these pieces. A broken jar lodged at an odd angle in a layer of sand. Sea-washed pottery fragments far inland from where they should be. A skeleton of a goat twisted in sediment, its bones marked by sudden trauma. Traces of brackish soil beneath the ruins of storerooms. Marine shells where only mountain herbs should have been. But in that moment, in the wet breath of the disaster itself, the story was not yet history. It was only disintegration. Above the village, on a ridge where olive trees clung to shallow roots, a few survivors watched. They had fled early, pulled by instinct or luck or position. They saw the wave swallow the place where they had woken that morning. They saw roofs collapse inward like folding hands. They saw familiar paths erased, the garden walls fall, the small shrine crack and vanish beneath a rush of water and sound. And when the wave finally withdrew, they saw only flatness, pools where homes had been. Trees lying in directions trees should not lie. A fishing net tangled in the upper branches of a tamarisk tree. And silence, again, too deep to name. Elsewhere on Crete, other coastal settlements suffered the same. Kamos, Amnizos, Palekastro, archaeological layers show it, a sudden intrusion of marine sand mixed with human artifacts buried quickly and unevenly. In some places, buildings were rebuilt. In others, they were never occupied again. The sea had changed the shape of the land and the mind. There was no record kept of how many lives were lost. The Minoans did not leave behind names etched in lament. But the loss was not only of life, it was of structure, of rhythm, of trust. In a society so closely tied to the sea, so open, so unwalled, the betrayal cut deeper than the wound. Yet even after the wave, life would go on. Survivors gathered. What they could, they lit fires on soaked ground. They wept and waited and rebuilt. But something had shifted. The palace's inland Knossos Phaistos still stood, but the arteries that fed them from the ports had been torn. Trade slowed. Faith cracked. Ceremonies became more insular. The art began to change, fewer marine motifs, fewer open spaces, more images of control. The wave had come, not with warning or anger, but with the inevitability of tectonics and time. It had no target. It left no message. It simply arrived and remade everything it touched. And in that remaking, it left behind not just destruction, but questions about safety, about cycles, about the sea itself. When we speak of disaster, we often speak of fire and conquest. But water, too, has its own kind of devastation. It is slower in some ways, faster in others. It fills rather than burns. It buries rather than breaks. But the aftermath is just as permanent. In that small village by the sea, whose name we do not know, the wave did not just flatten walls. It erased a pattern of life. And in its wake, it left behind the most haunting thing of all. The memory of what had been normal just moments before. And so the sea, which had retreated in silence, returned in violence, and retreated once more, continued to breathe against the shore. Its rhythm resumed, indifferent. The village was gone, but the water remained, as it always had, as it always will. When the water finally withdrew, it left behind more than destruction. It left silence, not the peaceful kind, but the weighty stillness of something that has ended without explanation. On the northern coast of Crete, where homes once stood in tidy rows and hearths had glowed beneath sloped rooftops, there was now only mud, thick, pungent, clinging to everything. Shards of pottery jutted from the muck like bones. A woven basket lay flattened in the street, its contents scattered and soaked. The path that had once led to the sea was erased, smoothed over by waves and debris, replaced by the shallow impressions of bare feet, survivors, searching for what was no longer there. Village had no name that history preserved. It was one of many small coastal settlements that fed the life of a broader, interconnected world. Their homes had been humble, their days filled with predictable rhythms, grinding grain, repairing nets, tending goats, giving thanks. Now those routines had been drowned in salt and silence. The smell of brine and rot filled the air. Fish carcasses dried where they had been flung, tangled in reeds or resting against broken masonry. Birds circled without landing. The earth was still trembling, though softly now, like the fading echo of a struck drum. Some had survived by luck, by timing, by being inland or uphill. They returned slowly, drawn by obligation or disbelief. What they found was not their village, but its outline. The buildings had collapsed or been carried away. The central courtyard was gone, replaced by a pool of standing water flecked with ash and floating leaves. The temple's corner stones remained, but the roof was shattered, its beams scattered like driftwood across the hillside. An altar was visible beneath a coating of mud, its carved symbols half erased. The gods, it seemed, had not stayed. They searched for others. A name called out again and again into the shapeless space. No answer came. Doors where they still existed hung open or lay on the ground. Inside, waterlogged mats and crushed storage jars offered no clues, only mess. The granaries had burst. The flour was soaked and turning. Animals that had survived the first wave now wandered, bleeding in hunger, trampling through what had once been gardens. A small goat with a torn leg limped among the wreckage, too confused to flee. Wells were fouled. The water smelled wrong, sulfurous, metallic. The ash had reached underground. No one dared drink from them. Clay cisterns had cracked, and in some places their contents spilled across floors, mixing with silt. Women began digging with their hands, scooping out mud, trying to salvage something useful. But even the tools had rusted in their frames. Bronze corroded fast in salt water. Wood split. Linen rotted. What was not taken by the wave had been undone by time compressed into minutes. Inland, at the edge of the farmland, the fields had not been spared. The crops, nearly ready for harvest, were drowned or broken. Salt crusted the soil. The irrigation ditches had collapsed or clogged with stones. A fig tree, bent backward by the force of the surge, leaned lifeless, its roots exposed. Olive branches lay tangled in fences. There was no comfort in the land, no reassurance that tomorrow would bring more than today had taken. People did what they always do in the wake of catastrophe. They began to move. They picked through the wreckage, looking for the small things that could make a life begin again. A cooking pot, dented but whole. A bronze blade, dull but usable. A bundle of cloth, twisted and stiff with mud. They pulled out broken furniture, tied together reeds, gathered driftwood to start fires that burned damp and low. They did not speak much. There was too little to say, and the air was thick with the kind of silence that asked for respect. Night fell without ceremony. There were no lamps to light, no hearths intact enough to warm. Some huddled near smoldering coals, wrapped in wet shawls. The stars above blinked faintly through a haze of dust, and ash still drifting on high-altitude winds. The moon reflected in puddles, motionless. Children cried softly, not from pain, but from the strange unfamiliarity of everything. The world had tilted, and no one had the language to explain how or why. In the days that followed, the bodies were found. Not many. Some had been taken by the wave. Others lay beneath collapsed beams or buried in wet earth. They were recovered with care, wrapped in mats, given rites where rites could still be performed. But the temple was no longer a sacred space. The priests, those who had survived, offered no answers. The usual offerings felt insufficient. There were no songs, only murmurs. The gods were quiet. Across Crete, similar scenes played out. Coastal towns suffered. Inland settlements took in those who fled. The great palaces remained standing, Knossos, Malia, Zakros, spared by their distance, by elevation, by luck. But even they felt the tremors, tasted the ash in their bread. Trade faltered. Grain shipments stopped. Letters written in linear A went unanswered. Sailors refused to put to sea. A silence began to spread, not just of sound, but of contact. The world became smaller and colder. Volcanic ash, fine as flour, had coated rooftops as far away as Egypt. Sunsets were redder. The Nile behaved unpredictably. Crops in other lands failed for reasons no one could name. But here, on this stretch of Cretan coast, the reasons were visible. They were caked in mud and scored into walls. Survivors spoke of a wave taller than the sky, of water that came from no storm, of the sea being taken and returned like punishment. They spoke of feeling abandoned not by neighbors, but by the divine. And yet they stayed. They began again, not out of hope, but out of habit. They repaired what they could. They moved the settlement uphill, closer to rock, farther from the shifting sea. The fields were left fallow for a time. Salt would need to wash out slowly. They learned to boil water longer, to watch the waves more closely. Children grew up with stories of a morning when the sea disappeared and what came next. No one forgot, but no one could fully understand either. The mud dried eventually. The broken beams were burned for warmth. The fish bones were picked clean. Grass returned to the edge of the terraces, but some parts of the village were never rebuilt. The lowest homes remained sunken and broken, their outlines visible only after the rains. They became markers, memorials, a quiet warning. There are disasters that mark a single moment, and there are those that stain everything that follows. This one did both. The survivors did not rebuild their world. They made a new one shaped by absence, softened by sorrow, lined with caution. They still honored the gods. They still sang. But the songs were slower now and the prayers more quiet. And though the sea once again kissed the shore in gentle waves, no one looked at it the same way. Its beauty remained, but beneath it lived the memory of something ancient and powerful, something that did not answer when called, something that, for a few long minutes, had swallowed their world, and then left behind a silence too deep to name. In the years that followed the wave and ash, the Minoans, once a seafaring, open-hearted civilization, began to turn inward. What had been a world shaped by movement, by rhythm and ritual, began to slow. The palaces still stood in places Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, but their courtyards were quieter now. The traders who once arrived in boats heavy with copper, ivory, and painted jars no longer came, or if they did, they brought hesitation with them. The ports had changed. The seabeds had shifted. The coastlines were unfamiliar. The routes that once pulsed with exchange now stood hollow. For a people whose economy flowed like tides, the stillness felt unnatural. The damage from the eruption was not just physical. It was temporal. Time itself had cracked. Whole villages had vanished beneath mud and water. The rituals tied to those places were severed. The temples built along coastal rocks, the ones closest to the sea deities, were either destroyed or abandoned, and those that remained received fewer offerings. The goddess of the sea, once generous and adored, now inspired silence. Where there had been libations, there was now doubt. Art began to change. The frescoes, once filled with fish and swirling currents, began to show more stillness, more structure. Dolphins no longer danced thr. All water, the lines stiffened. The figures seemed heavier. In palace storage rooms, sealed jars sat unopened. Records written in linear A stopped mid-sequence, not dramatically, just ended. There were no words for what had happened, and perhaps more painfully, no explanation. The gods, so present in every daily act, had gone quiet. Religious centers on mountain peaks, once climbed with song and offerings, saw fewer pilgrims. The sacred caves that had echoed with chants fell into disuse. Shrines that had stood along harbors, where sailors had once prayed before departure, were left to erode. The divine was no longer a comfort. It had become a reminder, and in the absence of faith, people sought other patterns. Some retreated into older traditions. Others looked to new forms of power, more terrestrial, more defensive, less trusting of the world outside their island. It is in this period that the architecture shifts. The new structures are less ornate, less fluid. Walls thicken, entrances narrow, windows shrink. Fortifications, once rare in Minoan society, begin to appear. These are not the gestures of a people expecting harmony. They are the quiet adaptations of a society no longer at ease with its surroundings. Trade had once brought not only goods, but ideas, songs from Anatolia, pigments from Egypt, designs from Syria. With the ports disrupted and the merchant paths unsure, these currents began to dry. Without trade, the economy narrowed. Without outside contact, the worldview contracted. The sea, which had connected the Minoans to the world, had proven itself unstable. Now, the world grew smaller. Even within the palaces, life shifted. The labyrinthine layout of Knossos, once symbolic of openness and ritual complexity, began to feel isolating. Spaces once filled with processions and music became stores for what remained. The central court saw fewer dances, fewer festivals. The bull-leaping ceremonies, those images so vivid in frescoes, may have dwindled or disappeared entirely. Not because the people had forgotten them, but because the confidence in rhythm, in repetition, in divine return had been shaken. This wasn't collapse in a sudden, dramatic fall. It was erosion, the kind that takes years, even decades, to make itself fully visible, but it could be felt in the gaps, in the years without major palace construction, in the pauses between ceremonial records, in the objects left unfinished. A generation grew up surrounded by reminders of a world that once worked differently. Their childhoods shaped not by grandeur, but by recovery. Not by celebration, but by quiet effort. The abandonment of coastal settlements began gradually. Villages along the northern shores were not always rebuilt. New communities appeared further inland, sometimes on hilltops or elevated ridges. Proximity to water was no longer a blessing. It was a risk. This shift meant not only a change in location, but in lifestyle. Fishing communities became farming ones. Maritime expertise faded. The stories told by grandparents began to sound more like myth than memory. In some regions, contact with the outside world resumed, but the tone had changed. The Minoans were no longer hosts of great ports, but cautious participants in shrinking trade. They may have still sent pottery and saffron and olive oil across the sea, but in smaller quantities, with less certainty. The prestige of Cretan goods diminished as new powers emerged, especially on the Greek mainland. The Mycenaeans, whose society favored fortresses and warfare, grew stronger during this period. And eventually they arrived in Crete, not as visitors, but as replacements. Archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean-style pottery appearing in Minoan contexts. Administrative systems shifted from linear A to linear B, a script used by Mycenaeans. The palaces did not fall in battle, but were gradually absorbed. The silence of the gods had been filled with the structure of foreign rule. For the Minoans, whose civilization had flourished in openness, in ceremony, in color and curve, this new phase must have felt unfamiliar. The elegance of their frescoes gave way to more rigid forms. The fluidity of their rituals gave way to rule-bound systems. Their legacy did not vanish, but it was folded into another story. And yet, the memory of who they were remains. In the layers of ash and the lines of pigment, in the rooms left half restored, in the fragments of a civilization that once believed the sea would always carry gifts and never grief. Their shock did not scream. It whispered. It moved through the stillness of altered temples, the hesitation of sailors who stayed home, the careful reshaping of doors and paths. It lived in the space between what was once assumed and what now required explanation. A civilization does not collapse only when its buildings fall. It unravels when its stories no longer hold, when the sea stops being a friend, when rituals echo into nothing, when silence lasts too long. And in that silence, a different kind of history begins, one shaped not by what survived, but by what no longer made sense. On the island once known as Thera, beneath layers of ash and silence, the town of Akrotiri sleeps. Its rooftops, once sun-warmed and whitewashed, are gone now, buried under meters of volcanic material. But the walls remain. So do the streets, the staircases, the rooms left just as they were on a day that never finished. There are no skeletal remains in Akrotiri, no scenes of panicked flight. It is a town interrupted, not by fire or sword, but by dust and time. Long before the eruption, Akrotiri had been a thriving community. A port town with winding alleys, multi-storied homes, and a deep connection to the sea. Its people lived with rhythm. They harvested saffron from crocus fields. They painted their homes with images of dolphins, antelopes, and floating blue monkeys. They stored wine and oil in wide-bellied jars. They crafted tools from obsidian and bronze, traded with neighbors near and far, and poured libations to unseen gods. Life here was not extravagant, but it was thoughtful, deliberate in its design, graceful in its pace. Then the volcano stirred. We do not know exactly how long the warning lasted. Perhaps weeks, perhaps only days. But signs came: earthquakes, tremors, a change in the air. The people of Akrotiri had experienced such unrest before. Their buildings bear the marks of past quakes, their foundations reinforced with care. But this time, something different happened. They left. In a remarkable stroke of timing or instinct, the town was evacuated. And when the eruption came, it buried not bodies, but belongings. Preserved not death, but life paused. Today, what remains under the volcanic layers is not a city destroyed in chaos, but a still life of Bronze Age daily routine. The rooms are quiet, but they speak. A cup rests on a windowsill. A loom stands in the corner of a bedroom. Bowls, carefully stacked, sit in alcoves. In one home, a basket of tools lies abandoned beside a workbench. In another, charred wood still supports the stone basin of a fireplace. Walls rise 2 or 3 stories high, complete with narrow staircases and small openings for light. The construction is intelligent, organic. Akrotiri was built to breathe. Frescoes, once vibrant, adorn the walls in places where the volcanic gas didn't strip away color. Some show women in layered skirts gathering saffron flowers. Others depict ships sailing between islands, their sails taut with imagined wind. One room is covered in an elaborate scene of spring, lilies curling up walls, swallows darting in air, red volcanic rock blooming with painted life. The figures do not face war or fear. They seem at ease, mid-motion, unaware that their world would be buried in silence. Pumice and ash encase the city gently, insulating it like snow. Unlike Vesuvius centuries later, Thera's eruption did not flash fry the town. It smothered it. The absence of heat marks of burned timbers or scorched artifacts suggests a different kind of burial, one that covered without obliterating. The voids left by wooden beams and furniture hint at what was once soft. Traces of textiles, of straw mats, of woven baskets remain only in outline. Half-eaten meals were found still sitting on dishes. Beds were left unmade. The final act had no curtain. It simply never finished. The town layout shows thought. Streets curve with the terrain. Drainage systems wind beneath the stone paths. There is a sense of community, homes pressed close, shared courtyards, thresholds worn by many feet. Akrotiri was not a ceremonial capital or a fortress. It was a place for living, a place where people ground grain, stitched clothing, listened to the sea, and laughed indoors on stormy days. And it is this ordinariness that lingers, not the grandeur, but the intimacy. There is no palace at Akrotiri, no throne room, no massive statues or altars. Power here seemed distributed, domestic. Homes were decorated with care, not dominance. Wealth was shown in detail, not in scale. Even the art speaks softly. The women gathering crocus are not bowed in labor, nor elevated in divinity. They are simply present, alert, attentive, moving with grace through their tasks. In their painted gestures, we find something rare, not myth, but moment. And then it ended. The ash rained down in phases, first fine, then coarse, then heavy. Roofs collapsed under the weight, windows sealed shut, streets filled with debris. Over time, the buildings vanished from sight. The island itself changed shape. Where there had been homes, there was now a caldera. Where there had been breath and color, there was only silence. Akrotiri remained hidden for over 3,000 years. It was not rediscovered until the late 19th century, and not fully excavated until the 1960s, when careful hands began to peel back the layers of ash. What they found was not treasure in the usual sense. No gold, no buried K. Ings, but something rarer, evidence of life uninterrupted by panic, of a world preserved in pause. Today, only part of the town is visible. Much remains beneath the surface, untouched, waiting. Scientists compare it to Pompeii, but the differences are quiet and profound. In Pompeii, the drama is human, people caught mid-flee, plaster casts of agony. In Akrotiri, the drama is absence. What's striking is not who was trapped, but that they left. The town froze, not at the moment of death, but just before. It is a freeze frame of preparedness, an echo of presence through things left behind. The colors of the frescoes fade now, slowly, as light and air return to walls that were dark for centuries. The baskets disintegrate under glass. The floors are walked by visitors, but the feeling of Akrotiri endures. A strange, soft reverence, as if the town is still exhaling slowly across centuries, the breath it held when the volcano began to speak. On Thera, the land remembers. The pumice cliffs rise in layers, visible to the eye, marking time in stone. The caldera still steams on occasion. Boats drift over the flooded center, unaware that below them lies not just magma, but memory. A town with murals and silence. A place where time folded in on itself. Where beds were left unmade, not from carelessness, but from a moment that never returned. What does it take to collapse a civilization? Not always a war, not always a plague. Sometimes the unraveling begins in silence. In the soft failure of one harvest, followed by another. In the cracked plaster of a shrine that no longer draws offerings. In the slow decay of trade routes when boats cease to return and roads fall quiet. Collapse is rarely a single event. It is more often an accumulation of stress, of loss, of unhealed wounds, until something essential gives way. The Minoan civilization, once thriving in the eastern Mediterranean, offers no single moment of destruction. It offers instead a mosaic of disruptions. An eruption, a wave, the ash that darkened the sky. But also the days after when people gathered what was left, hoping to rebuild something that still made sense. And yet, what had been broken was not just material. It was structural, cultural, emotional. It was faith in the order of things. Civilizations depend on more than walls and weapons. They rely on rhythms, on the predictability of the seasons. The trust that water will flow, that fields will bear, that the sea will provide and protect. When those rhythms falter, the center begins to slip. Archaeologists describe the layers, ash, debris, abandoned buildings. But behind each layer is a different kind of fracture, one that cannot be excavated by tools. The food systems of the Minoans were delicate, though ingenious. Terraced hillsides, careful irrigation, a reliance on olives, grapes, grains, and goats. But all of it rested on balance, the cooperation of soil, weather, labor, and peace. After the eruption of Thera, after the tsunami carved through coastal towns, much of that balance was lost. Salt poisoned the fields, wells were fouled, storage rooms were cracked and emptied. Even where famine didn't strike, the anxiety of uncertainty did. People don't always starve before collapse. Sometimes they stop planting with hope. They ration before scarcity arrives. They tighten their rituals, double their offerings, or cease them altogether. Faith becomes brittle. In Crete, the shrines near the coast, once abundant, fell out of use. Mountain sanctuaries grew more prominent. Perhaps the people sought higher ground not only for safety, but for spiritual clarity. Perhaps they believed the gods had relocated too. Spiritual systems are often described as resilient, but they are not immune to trauma. When the divine becomes unpredictable, belief must either change or retreat. The Minoans worshipped in fluid spaces, open courtyards, natural caves, sacred groves. Their gods were not remote. They were present, imminent, woven into wind and stone and sea. But after the sea turned violent, after the earth cracked open, that intimacy became danger. It is difficult to worship what you fear too much. Some societies respond to crisis by becoming more rigid. Hierarchies harden, rules multiply, rituals intensify. Others fragment, decentralizing, turning to smaller kinship units, breaking power into pieces. The Minoans may have experienced both. Their grand palaces, once centers of redistribution and ceremony, began to fade. Administrative systems, once smooth and wide-reaching, narrowed or disappeared. Linear inscriptions, once common, slowed to a trickle. Communication broke down. And so did trade. For a civilization whose power rested on seaborne commerce, this was no small loss. The Minoans did not mine their own copper or tin. Their bronze came from afar. Their luxury goods, glass beads, exotic oils, pigments, depended on distant networks. When the ships stopped coming, wealth became static, without exchange. Even the finest craftsmanship sits unused. But it's not only the loss of goods that weakens a society. It's the loss of connection, of stories, of relevance. A merchant port that no longer hosts strangers becomes just another village. A palace with nothing to distribute becomes just a building. The Minoans were no longer at the center. They became an edge. Science today helps us trace these patterns with new tools. Ice cores reveal traces of sulfur from the Thera eruption, confirming its global reach. Tree rings in Anatolia show years of poor growth, hinting at environmental stress. Pollen analysis from lake beds reveals shifts in vegetation, signs of land abandonment, of altered agriculture, of change. But these are fragments, clues, not conclusions. The deeper truths live in human behavior, in how people respond when the world they know begins to dissolve. In Akrotiri, people fled before the final blast. In Crete, some stayed behind and rebuilt, others moved uphill, inland, away. And some, perhaps, simply stopped, not out of despair, but out of fatigue. The kind that comes when effort no longer guarantees return. Cultural fragility is a subtle thing. It does not mean weakness. It means dependence on order, on belief, on systems that must all work in harmony. When one thread frays, others must tighten. But when too many loosen at once, even a strong fabric can unravel. The Minoans had no shortage of innovation, skill, or artistry. What they lacked in the end was insulation from cascading failure. Collapse is not the opposite of success. It is a phase in the life of complex systems. It doesn't arrive suddenly or all at once. Often it looks like adaptation, like moving uphill, like changing the color of the fresco, like storing a little more grain than usual. And then, one day, it becomes clear that something is not coming back. By the 14th century BCE, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece had arrived in Crete. Their writing system, linear B, appears where linear A disappears. Their pottery replaces Minoan forms. Their gods begin to take space in the stories. The transition is not marked by a single conquest. It is more of an absorption, a quiet taking over, a civilization already in retreat being gently overwritten. But even in collapse, something remains. The art lives on in fragments, in echoes. The frescoes still speak. The palaces, even in ruin, offer models of architecture, of light, of air. The spirit of the Minoans, their openness, their reverence for nature, their devotion to beauty did not vanish. It diffused, it traveled, it left traces. Civilizations do not fall into nothing. They fall into other civilizations, into memory, into soil, into stories whispered at the edge of sleep, where the quiet cracks in history let us feel what it means to lose not everything, but something essential. And so, when we speak of sudden collapse, what we're really describing is a slow forgetting, a fading of rhythms, a drifting of meaning, a soft silence where certainty used to be. Far to the south of Thera, beyond the waters of the Aegean and the bend of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt stood, stable, ancient, enduring. Along the banks of the Nile, temples cast long shadows over fields turned by slow, deliberate hands. Pharaohs ruled from cities of limestone and papyrus, their walls etched with hymns to Ra and Osiris. The cycle of flood and planting, of reaping and ritual, formed the quiet backbone of a civilization that had already seen 1,000 years pass in steady rhythm. But then something changed. The skies turned red. The records are scattered, indirect, yet unsettling. Papyrus scrolls speak of the sun veiled in haze, of days that ended early, of seasons that failed to follow their script. In the Ipuwer papyrus, thought to reflect a time of chaos, there are lines that whisper of ash and confusion. The river is blood, the grain is gone, and nothing grows. Not a precise record, but a feeling, a civilization shaken by forces it could not name. It's possible the eruption of Thera reached Egypt not in waves or fire, but in sky and soil. The ash plume carried by high-altitude winds drifted south and east. Fine particles settled on the fields. The light dimmed. Temperatures dropped by degrees, just enough to nudge a delicate balance. The annual Nile flood, so central to Egyptian agriculture, may have been disrupted. In a world where cosmic harmony and agricultural cycles were intertwined, these disruptions were not merely environmental, they were spiritual. A harvest that failed was a message from the gods. Egypt had known droughts before. It had seen its river run low, but rarely with such mystery. There had been no great war, no plague, yet temples filled with prayers for fertility and rebirth, for restoration. The priests adjusted their rituals, recalculated omens, and looked to the stars for meaning. But the source of their hardship lay far away, on an island whose name they may not have even known. Yet the connection between Egypt and the Aegean was real. Trade routes stretched like threads across the sea. From Crete, the Minoans sent pottery, oils, fine textiles. From Egypt came gold, papyrus, carved ivory, scarabs etched with names of gods. In frescoes from Akrotiri and elsewhere, Egyptian motifs appear, the shapes of lotus blossoms, the profile of a pharaoh. In tombs along the Nile, Minoan goods were buried with noble dead. These were not strangers. They were partners in a wide and fluid world. Diplomatic gifts moved between courts. Paintings, perhaps, carried meanings deeper than beauty, signs of alliance, respect, and shared power. But after the eruption, the ships came less often. The routes felt longer, the goods arrived slower, and in their absence, the imagination filled the space. Stories began to swirl of lands swallowed by the sea, of islands lost in flame. These were not yet the legends of Atlantis, but the roots of something similar. Distant tragedy woven into myth. In Egyptian mythology, chaos is always near, just beyond the ordered world, just beneath the surface of the known. Isfit, the force of disorder, lurks, waiting to surge. And the role of the pharaoh, the priests, the rituals, is to keep it at bay, to maintain the balance of things. When that balance is upset, it is not merely misfortune. It is cosmic rupture. The red skies over Egypt, the thin harvests, the distant quakes felt as tremors under stone temples. All would have been seen not just as natural, but as divine signs. Echoes of something breaking, far away but close enough to matter. Thera's eruption was one of the most powerful in human memory. It left no direct message in Egypt's hieroglyphs, no carved depiction of a mountain exploding into ash. But its fingerprint is there in patterns and gaps, in sudden shifts in administration, in changes in diplomatic tone, in the archaeology of trade where once abundant Minoan goods begin to decline. And perhaps even in the silences, the things not said, the years skipped over, the rituals that had to be rewritten. Some scholars point to Pharaoh Ahmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty, and the mysterious references to storms and fire in the sky during his reign. The Tempest Stela, erected in Thebes, tells of wind and rain, of the heavens in disarray, of buildings damaged across the land. It does not name Thera. It speaks in poetic terms. But its timing aligns close enough to suggest that even a distant volcano could shake the pillars of a distant kingdom. The reach of disaster is often underestimated. It is not only the land nearby that feels it. The wind does not ask permission. The sky does not stop at borders. Egypt, ancient and ordered, could not remain untouched. It heard the echoes in grain that would not ripen, in ships that failed to arrive, in myths that began to shift. And still the Nile flowed. Even in years of thin water, of silt touched by ash, it remained the artery of the land. The people adjusted. They remembered. They moved forward with the quiet persistence that defines ancient endurance. But something had changed. Somewhere an island had collapsed. Somewhere a people had fled. And the ripple reached even here to temples of stone and reeds along the riverbank. Disaster, when distant, becomes story. And story becomes memory. And memory becomes belief. The Minoan eruption, though forgotten in name, left a shape in the minds of those who lived far beyond the blast. A scar not on buildings, but on ideas about what the world could become when balance failed. In the long corridors of Karnak, in the shaded halls of Luxor, the columns still rise. The sun still slants through them in late afternoon. The gods still stand in painted relief, but hidden in the silence between inscriptions is the memory of a sky that once burned red. A signal from the north, carried by wind, written in dust, that even the strongest civilization cannot escape the whisper of distant fire. Long after the Minoans vanished, long after ash had settled into soil and the palaces fell into silence, the memory of a world undone by water lingered. Not in official records, not in written names, but in fragments of pottery, of trade routes lost, of habits forgot. And in time, those fragments became stories. Stories became echoes, and echoes became myth. In the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Plato told a tale. He spoke of a powerful island nation, rich and advanced, that had once ruled the seas. Its people were skilled in engineering, philosophy, and law. Their temples were gilded, their canals deep and straight. But pride came before their fall. And in a single terrible day and night, the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, leaving behind only legend. Plato claimed this story came from Egypt, passed down through priests, recited to the lawgiver Solon, and finally written by his own hand. He said it 9,000 years before his time. The details were elaborate, the geography intricate. Atlantis was said to lie beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the Atlantic now stretches wide. But something in the story felt closer, not in distance perhaps, but in shape. The Minoans had once ruled an island empire. Their fleets moved without threat. Their art showed balance, not war. They traded with Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece. Their cities were carefully planned, adorned with bright frescoes and running water. They worshipped in caves and on mountaintops. And then, one day, the sea came for them. Not in punishment, but in consequence of a volcano erupting, of a caldera collapsing, of waves that erased. Akrotiri buried beneath pumice. Coastal towns on Crete swept by tsunamis. Fields salted, faith shaken, rhythms lost. There was no dramatic reckoning, no moral failing etched in stone. Only nature's quiet decision to undo what had taken centuries to build. Yet the impression of suddenness, of a flourishing world consumed by the sea, could not be forgotten. Plato's tale, like all myths, carries truths in unusual containers. He writes of Atlantis as a parable, a warning against hubris. But the imagery, a noble people, sophisticated, overtaken by water, fits the shape of what archaeology would one day uncover in the Aegean. Not precisely, not perfectly, but gently. Enough to wonder whether the legend of Atlantis carries within it the fossil of Minoan loss. Historians debate this connection. Some dismiss it entirely, citing Plato's philosophical purpose, his penchant for allegory. Others suggest he drew loosely from Mediterranean memories, stories passed through generations, altered by time. And indeed, the ancient world did not record cataclysms as we do now. There were no seismographs, no tide gauges, no measurements of ashfall, but there were stories, and stories remembered differently. The eruption of Thera would have sent shockwaves not only through stone, but through imagination. Sky turned dark, sea pulled back, land vanished, survivors fled, trade faltered, famine followed. And in the wake of it all, memory bent, reshaped, and softened the edges of truth until only the essential outline remained, a beautiful island gone in a moment. Plato never mentioned the Minoans. He never named Knossos or Akrotiri, but his story came after centuries of oral transmission. Greek sailors had long crossed the same waters. Some may have passed near the caldera without knowing its story. Others may have seen ruins on Crete, strange, broken, magnificent, and wondered who had built them. Even without answers, wonder leaves a mark. The myth of Atlantis endured not because of accuracy, but because of resonance. A world lost beneath the sea taps into something deep and shared, the fear of nature's indifference, the fragility of progress, the longing to explain ruins left behind. And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether Atlantis was Thera or not. What matters is what it preserves, the shape of a disappearance softened into story. Today, Akrotiri rests beneath a roof of steel and glass. Visitors walk along suspended paths, peering down at frescoed walls, at staircases that lead nowhere. There is no gold, no massive statues, only daily life paused. It feels too quiet to become legend, but perhaps that's why it did. Atlantis, as Plato told it, was a cautionary tale. But Atlantis, as remembered by the world, became something else, a symbol of what we fear to lose, a vision of grace undone, a mystery where facts dissolve but meaning endures. The Minoans may never have called themselves by that name. They left no epic poems, no king's lists carved in stone. Their voices are quiet in the archaeological record, and yet they echo in myths, in ruins, in the unsteady memories of those who came after. Civilizations fall, stories rise, and somewhere between the two, the sea remembers, not in words but in silence, in waves that carry no message but reshape coastlines, in currents that brush across the caldera's rim, still circling the ghost of an island that may have inspired a legend or simply survived through it. In the long quiet that followed the wave, something began to shift, not suddenly, not with collapse, but with a slow unraveling thread by thread. The Minoan civilization, once the elegant pulse of the Aegean, began to fade, not in ruins or fire, but in subtler signs, in pottery styles that changed, in trade routes that narrowed, in harbors where silence replaced the sound of sails being drawn and anchors lowered. It was not the end, but it was no longer the same. In the centuries before, Minoan ships had ruled the waves. Their hulls carried oil, textiles, painted jars, and the rhythms of a culture rooted in sea and ceremony. Their ports welcomed goods and languages from Egypt, Cyprus, and Anatolia. Their scripts recorded offerings and inventories. Their frescoes celebrated not war, but nature, flowers, dolphins, birds in flight. Their palaces were airy and unfortified. Theirs was a power built not on conquest, but on connection. But now that connection was fraying. The aftermath of the Thera eruption had reached far beyond the loss of Akrotiri or the damage to Crete's coastal settlements. It disrupted balance. The tsunami left stretches of shoreline uninhabitable. Ash disrupted agriculture. Sacred spaces were broken, some abandoned entirely. And in the decades that followed, the world around the Minoans kept changing. The sea, once a trusted partner, became a quieter place. Fewer ships left. Fewer ships returned. In the archaeological record, the decline leaves gentle fingerprints. Pottery, once distinct with its fluid, marine forms, spirals, octopuses, flowing waves, begins to stiffen. Designs become geometric, less organic. The clay itself changes. Once vibrant colors lose their confidence. It is as though the art, like the people, began to turn inward. Palace life continued at first. Knossos, the largest of them all, still hummed with activity. But the other great complexes, Malia, Zakros, Phaistos, show signs of decline. Fires blackened storerooms. Administrative buildings were not rebuilt. Seals were lost. Records disappear. There are fewer signs of grand feasts, fewer imported luxury goods, fewer offerings to the gods. The great redistribution systems, which once channeled goods across the island, slowed and fragmented. Villages on the coast were not always inhabited. Some were moved inland. Others were left altogether, their ruins gradually claimed by weeds and salt. The rhythm of life shifted. Once bound tightly to trade and tide, the people of Crete began to live smaller, more localized lives. Fields were tended. Bread was baked. But the sweeping currents of influence and diplomacy ebbed. The island remained beautiful, but quieter. Meanwhile, new powers were rising. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans grew stronger. Their palaces were built high, with thick walls and armed guards. They recorded their world in Linear B, an evolution of Minoan script but used for very different ends. Their frescoes still showed color, but they also showed spears. Their wealth grew and they began to look outward, toward the islands, toward Crete. It's not clear exactly when the Mycenaeans arrived in Crete, perhaps around 1450 BCE. There is no single battle recorded, no dramatic invasion carved in stone. But the change is visible. Mycenaean pottery appears in Minoan sites. Mycenaean-style weapons and burial goods begin to dominate the archaeological layers. The linear, tablets vanish, replaced by linear be the tone shifts. What was once a world of painted fish and soft courtyards now feels more guarded, more hierarchical, more measured by rule than ritual. And yet it was not a complete replacement. The Minoans were not erased. Their influence lingered in the shapes of columns, the designs of jewelry, the layout of temples. Their art was copied, their scripts adapted, their gods perhaps renamed but not entirely forgotten. Their cultural spirit soaked into the fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean, even as their political power dissolved. Decline in this case was not death. It was transition, a slow handover of influence, a fading voice in a room that had once echoed with song. Crete remained inhabited. Towns grew again. Knossos continued for some time under Mycenaean control. But the identity that had once spread across the Aegean, subtle, sea-loving, goddess-honoring, open, and curious, now rested in the past. The reasons are layered, not simple. Environmental shock weakened their base. Disrupted trade limited resources. Loss of religious certainty may have fragmented unity. and rising competition from mainland Greece made the open, unfortified structure of Minoan society increasingly vulnerable. In the end, it was not one failure, but many pressures, economic, environmental, cultural, that converged. We are left with fragments, a clay tablet half-written, a fresco left incomplete, a storage jar buried beneath collapsed beams, each a small echo of a people who once believed the world could be shaped with beauty and trust, each a sign that even the strongest current can shift without warning. Today, the ruins of the Minoan palaces lie in the sun, surrounded by fields and low hills. Tourists walk through them quietly, beneath reconstructed columns. They look at painted walls and try to imagine a civilization that once needed no walls of stone. The sea shimmers in the distance. Boats drift lazily past the coast, and the wind, still carrying salt and thyme, moves softly through empty courtyards once filled with dancers. Civilizations do not vanish all at once. They dim, they fade, and if we listen carefully, we can still hear them, not in monuments or conquest, but in the curve of a painted wave, in the outline of a vessel, in the quiet elegance of what was left behind. In the quiet after collapse, when the frescoes began to fade and the harbors filled more with memory than ships, another force stirred across the sea. On the Greek mainland, beyond the reach of Minoan grace and ritual, the Mycenaeans watched. Their citadels were built on hills, their walls thick and high. They did not worship in open courtyards or paint spirals of the sea. Their world was sharper, harder, shaped by bronze and battle. And when the Minoan world faltered, the Mycenaean world moved forward. It was not a sudden invasion, not a single battle. There are no epic poems that recount a dramatic crossing to Crete, no tablets that mark a conquest. What happened was slower, more practical. The Minoan palaces weakened politically, economically, spiritually, and the Mycenaeans filled the space they left behind. The trade networks that once carried saffron, wool, and oil under Minoan control now shifted their allegiance. The ports once built for soft-sailed ships took in newer vessels. The island that had been a center of elegance became a frontier of opportunity. By the mid-15th century BCE, Mycenaean artifacts begin to appear more regularly on Crete. Pottery, weapons, jewelry, all bearing the angular marks of a culture more interested in control than celebration. The linear B script, an adaptation of Minoan Linear A, emerged in palace archives. But its language was Greek, not Minoan. It spoke of inventories, lists, rations, assignments, not of gods in fields or festivals at sea. It marked a transition from story to schedule, from rhythm to rule. The Mycenaeans were not a sea people by birth. They came from the hills, from places where stone rose and water retreated. Their cities, Mycenae, Pylos, Turins, were built for siege. Their kings were warriors first. Their gods resembled humans more than forces of nature. And yet, when the opportunity came, they adapted. They sailed. They traded. They learned to speak in the tones of empire. In Knossos, the great Minoan palace continued for a time under Mycenaean control. The frescoes were repainted. The records kept, but the style shifted. What had been curved became straight. What had flowed now stood still. The columns still bore their red and black, but the air inside felt different. The Minoan palaces had been open, light filtering through skylights, breezes passing through colonnades. The Mycenaean mind preferred enclosure, protection. Rooms became more segmented, purpose more defined. The difference between the two cultures was not only in architecture. It lived in how they saw power. The Minoans led by coordination, by ritual, by symbolism. The Mycenaeans led by command. Their kings, or wanaks, were not ceremonial figures. They collected tribute, commanded armies, distributed labor. Their society was deeply stratified. The tombs they built, beehive-shaped thal carved into the hills, were made not just to honor the dead, but to remind the living who ruled. In the wider world, the Mycenaeans rose as Minoan influence faded. Where Minoan ships had once moved unarmed through the Mediterranean, Mycenaean fleets carried weapons. Where Minoan art depicted dancers and lilies, Mycenaean art showed chariots and duels. It was not just a cultural difference. It was a response to a changing world, one more uncertain, more competitive, more violent. The memory of Thera's eruption, of the tsunami, of the dimmed sky, still lingered. The earth had spoken. Now the sword would speak too. But the rise of Mycenae was not built on destruction alone. They absorbed, they learned. They did not erase the Minoans, but they reinterpreted them. They took the palatial system and made it their own. They continued the traditions of seal stones, of storage jars, of shrine offerings, but within a framework more defined by hierarchy than harmony. Minoan goddesses may have been reimagined into Mycenaean ones, just as languages shift across generations. Even beauty remained, but it served new purposes. Ornament, yes, but also display, power in gold, not just in gesture. The Mycenaeans expanded their reach. Their influence spread across the Aegean and beyond. They became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean for over a century. They left behind great tombs, sprawling administrative centers, records of economic precision. They inherited the sea, though they did not love it as the Minoans had. They used it, crossed it, measured it, and in that use they flourished. But this chapter was only a moment, for the Mycenaean world too would face its own decline, not from wave or ash, but from inner fracture and outer pressure. By the 12th century BCE, their palaces burned, their records stopped, their language fell silent, and another silence settled over the Aegean. Yet here in the rise of Mycenae, we glimpse a deeper truth, that history does not end, it shifts. One civilization's disaster is another's opening. One people's loss becomes another's beginning. The past does not fall like a wall. It folds, turns, gives way to new hands. The world that rose from the ashes of Thera was not the same, but it carried traces. The Mycenaeans built on ground that still remembered footsteps. Their story was not separate from the Minoans, but layered atop it, a continuation, a redefinition. And as we walk now through the ruins of both cultures, along the narrow staircases of Knossos or through the Lion Gate at Mycenae, we feel the echo. Not of triumph or defeat, but of time, of rhythm altered, of a sea that forgets and remembers all at once. In a quiet room in the ruins of an ancient palace, baked clay tablets lie where they were once pressed and stacked by careful hands. Their surface is marked with neat, deliberate symbols, lines, loops, notches arranged with purpose, but today silent. This is Linear A, the written language of the Minoans, and no one alive can read it. Linear A first appeared around 1800 BCE, used to record what mattered to a thriving society. Inventories, perhaps, offerings, transactions, ritual preparations. These tablets were not literature. They were records of a civilization that operated with complexity and structure, yet left behind no translation. The language encoded in these symbols has resisted decipherment. We know the characters, we understand the patterns, but the voice behind them has vanished. Most of the tablets come from palaces, Knossos, Malia, Phaistos, Zakros. They are rectangular, palm-sized, scored into soft clay with a stylus, then fired by accident when the buildings that held them burned. The signs run in linear rows, hence their name. They look familiar beside Linear B, the later script used by the Mycenaeans. But Linear B was Greek. Linear A is not. It speaks a language unknown to us, a language that died without passing on its sound. And this is where the tragedy deepens, not in destruction but in silence. Because to lose a script is to lose a way of seeing, to forget not just what people said but how they thought, what words they chose for the sea, for bread, for sorrow, what metaphors they used when describing gods, what humor lived in their marketplaces, what formality marked their prayers. These were not abstract records, they were the scaffolding of memory. And now they are marks on clay that whisper, but do not speak. Across centuries, scholars have tried. They've counted frequency, compared signs, followed trails across regions and time. Some symbols match those in linear B, others are unique. The syntax resists mapping. The language may have had no descendants. It is a voice without an echo. Perhaps it was pre-Indo-European, a linguistic island as isolated as its geography. Perhaps it was spoken widely once, then narrowed to the palaces of Crete, where scribes kept records no one else could understand. Perhaps it faded before it could evolve. What we do know is that writing mattered to the Minoans. They used seals to mark ownership, labels on jars to note contents. They recorded with care even if their script didn't sprawl into myth like Mesopotamian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. There is no known Minoan epic, no creation tale, no funerary prayer, but there is form, structure, intention. It is not the absence of thought, but the absence of continuity that left these signs stranded in time. Linear A disappeared slowly. The palaces that housed its scribes were damaged by fire, then by neglect. After the eruption of Thera and the subsequent social shifts, the Mycenaeans arrived and adopted parts of Minoan administration. But they wrote in their own tongue using a similar-looking script, but repurposed to fit Greek. Linear B overtook Linear A not with malice, but with convenience. The scribes adapted. The language changed. And one day, the old tablets were no longer copied. Their symbols became obsolete, then forgotten, then unreadable. There is a strange irony in how well these tablets were preserved, fired by accidental flames, buried in palace ruins, yet how little they can tell us. We can hold them, we can date them, but we cannot hear them. They are artifacts of function that carry emotion we cannot access. And so we guess, we make lists, we compare strokes, we assign probable meanings to recurring phrases. But the certainty never comes. The meaning stays just beyond the reach of translation. This is not unique to the Minoans. Other scripts have vanished. The Harappan writing system, etched into seals from the Indus Valley, remains unread. The Rongorongo glyphs of Easter Island whisper from wooden tablets that no longer match any living tongue. Language, for all its power, is fragile. It can survive millennia or fade in a single generation. It needs breath, repetition, purpose. Without those, it becomes decoration. And so Linear A stands as a quiet monument, not just to Minoan civilization, but to the idea that memory can disappear even when the evidence remains. We study the symbols, we marvel at their order, but the voices behind them, the actual sounds spoken in kitchens, enshrines in marketplaces are gone. No descendant language, no bilingual tablet, no Rosetta Stone. Only rows of symbols once meaningful, now mute. It's tempting to think of language as permanent, as something carved in stone. But it is. It is breath. It is habit. And once lost, it leaves behind not absence, but questions. Who wrote these records? What did they fear? What did they love? What words did they use to describe the moment the sky darkened over Thera? How did they name the sea that turned against them? In the silence of these tablets, we feel the weight of what has been unspoken. Not erased, just untranslated, still waiting, perhaps forever. And in that quiet, there's a kind of reverence not for mystery, but for the reminder that civilizations do not only leave behind ruins and roads. They leave behind ways of thinking. And when the voice disappears, even the clearest script becomes a murmur. The Minoans wrote for function, but the beauty of their script, the rhythm of their signs, suggests something deeper. A voice lost not just in language, but in feeling. And so, the tablets remain, not broken but unread, preserved in fire, kept in clay, whispering across centuries in a language no longer known. The island of Thera, now known as Santorini, rises in rings, crescent cliffs carved around a drowned caldera. Tourists sip wine atop whitewashed rooftops. The sunsets here are famous, but deep beneath the painted balconies and the windswept churches lies another Thera, quiet, buried, and waiting. The volcano did not just destroy, it preserved. And modern archaeologists with brushes and trowels learned to listen to ash. It began in the late 19th century, when Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos saw something curious. In 1939, he proposed that the sudden decline of the Minoan civilization might be traced not to war, but to nature, specifically the eruption of Thera. His theory was bold. At the time, few imagined that a volcano could change the course of an entire culture. But Marinatos looked to ash, to gaps in history, to the clues that nature leaves behind when it does not explain itself. In 1967, he began excavating on Santorini at a site called Akrotiri. What he found beneath layers of volcanic debris was not simply rubble. It was a city silent, intact, paused mid-movement, streets with gutters, staircases still standing, vases unbroken, murals untouched, no charred bodies, no frantic writings, just life interrupted. The ash had settled thickly, cooling quickly and protecting everything it touched. In some rooms, the beds were unmade. In others, loom weights still hung by the walls. Kitchens held grinding stones and storage jars. The eruption had buried Akrotiri so thoroughly that oxygen never reached its walls. Colors remained. Even wooden furniture turned to ash, left behind perfect molds in the hardened layers. And within this strange, hushed preservation, archaeologists found something more elusive, a moment in time. Akrotiri is often called the Pompeii of the Aegean, but its story is older and more delicate. The eruption that buried it likely occurred between 1600 and 1500 BCE, though exact dates remain debated. Radiocarbon tests, tree ring patterns, and Egyptian chronologies all offer clues, each whispering slightly different truths. But the eruption was massive, one of the largest in recorded prehistory. It reshaped the island, sent tsunamis racing toward Crete, and cloaked skies in a volcanic winter. And yet it left behind no written records, only layers. As archaeologists peeled back the ash, they began to reconstruct daily life. A fresco showed blue monkeys, exotic animals never native to Thera, but perhaps remembered from distant lands. Another wall revealed lilies and swallows, their lines elegant, unhurried. In an upper room, a mural depicted a fleet of ships moving between ports, suggesting not just seafaring skill but memory, perhaps even myth. These were not mere decorations. They were declarations of identity, gently offered by hands that would never return. And there were pots, so many pots, some empty, some sealed, some etched with linear A, the mysterious script of the Minoans, still undeciphered. It was on these humble vessels that archaeologists learned to read in absence. They traced trade patterns by the clay's origin, identified food residues trapped in glaze, saw how some shapes traveled further than others. It was commerce, faith, and routine, all encoded in everyday objects, never meant for storytelling. The people of Akrotiri did not return. Whatever warning the volcano gave, tremors, smoke, strange tides, it was enough. The city was empty when the final explosion came. This absence, too, became evidence. Unlike Pompeii, no bodies remained to mark the final moment. But in this silence, archaeologists read a kind of grace. The people had time. They may have fled, or sailed, or gathered elsewhere. Their story did not end here, it simply vanished from the record. As excavations continued, the challenge became one not of finding, but of interpreting. Each new layer added questions. Who governed Akrotiri? What gods did they worship? Was this city part of a larger Minoan network, or something separate? Archaeologists had to become translators of absence, building meaning from absence, harmony from fragments. The work is slow. Layers are removed grain by grain, plaster is stabilized, pigment is fixed, rooms are mapped, nothing is rushed. Even a single centimeter of soil might hide a wall's edge or a shattered vase. Each discovery changes the shape of the past, not suddenly, but slowly, like a fresco appearing through dust. Modern tools have joined the quiet. Ground-penetrating radar now reveals structures still buried. Microscopes analyze plant seeds from ancient drains. Chemical analysis uncovers trade links between Thera and Cyprus, Egypt and Anatolia. Yet for all the science, the excavation remains an act of patience. The earth does not volunteer its secrets. It allows them gently. Crete has no grand statues, no royal tombs. It has no alphabet that we can read, no clear timeline of kings. But what it offers is rare, a glimpse of how people lived before disaster without mythologizing the end. There are no war scenes, no heroic murals, just processions, dancers, offerings. A town that had learned to live with the sea, not command it. And this is where archaeology shifts from science into art. For each wall uncovered, there are questions not just of what, but why. Why were these rooms painted so vibrantly? Why were certain streets wider than others? Why was a ship fleet painted across an entire room? The answers live in context, in repetition, in patterns, and in humility, a recognition that we may never fully understand the mind that carved a symbol into wet clay. As of today, only a fraction of Crete has been excavated. Much remains hidden beneath protective roofs and undisturbed soil. The work continues, though not always quickly. Funding shifts, techniques evolve, yet the commitment remains not to unearth everything, but to unearth gently. To preserve not just objects, but the mood of the place. To walk through Crete now is to move through stillness. The rooms are empty, but they do not feel abandoned. There is a rhythm in the staircases, a memory in the grooves of the stone paths. And above it all, the caldera watches, vast, sunlit, and calm for now. Archaeology does not raise the dead. It does not replace what was lost, but it gives shape to forgetting. It reminds us that even when language fails, even when names are gone, the shape of a life remains in tools, in walls, in what people leave behind when they do not know they're leaving. In the ash of Thera, a civilization sleeps, not shattered, just paused. And in the hands of archaeologists, that sleep becomes a story not told all at once, but patiently, layer by layer, whispered back into light. Time, like the tide, pulls memory back and forth. But the sea holds on to things. It cradles broken amphorae and sunken cities with the same softness it gives to shells and drifting kelp. It remembers even when we don't. And sometimes, when the wind stills and the water darkens just so, we're reminded that the past is never fully gone, only sleeping, just beneath the surface. Long after the fires died and the ash settled, long after the palaces were emptied and the gods fell silent, the sea kept whispering. Not with malice, not with guilt, but with memory. It held the bones of ships that never returned. It preserved walls painted with leaping bulls and floating lilies. It carried the silence of thousands who stood too near the shore when the water first pulled away. There, in the hush between receding wave and roaring return, history tilted. But the sea did not forget. We often think of disasters as sudden things, violent, loud, clear. But the truest ones are slow. They slip through seasons, rearrange what was once trusted. What Thera began, the sea completed. And in that rising wave, there was no intention, just consequence. The wave came not as punishment, but as release, the earth shifting, the ocean responding, and people, caught in between, looking up too late. And yet they lived, for a time. The Minoans walked their shores, they harvested fish, they made offerings to the sea as both god and provider. They painted its creatures onto their walls, sang its rhythms into their myths. They believed it sacred, and in some way they were right. The sea gives life, but it also holds a deeper truth that it takes nothing personally. When it rises, it remembers only movement. We return now not as survivors but as seekers. Divers comb ancient harbors. Archaeologists dust off remnants of kitchens and temples. They study cores pulled from ocean beds, read the patterns of ash and coral like fragile poems. And each fragment, each layer of pumice or salted clay, whispers of the wave, not just the one that struck, but the many physical, cultural, invisible that follow such a loss. Thera's story is not one of simple ruin. It is a story of memory held in water, of nature marking time in flood rather than stone. The ocean did not erase the Minoans. It archived them, like old letters packed away in silt, like lullabies no longer sung, but still remembered by the wind that once carried them to sea. And so we ask not what happened, but how to listen, how to sit beside the sea and hear more than surf and gull, how to feel the weight of stories that have no voice, only residue. The sea cannot speak, but it echoes, in salt lines against crumbling rock, in the smooth curve of pottery found offshore, in the odd quiet that sometimes fills a harbor at dusk. It's easy to imagine we've outgrown such fates, that satellites and walls and warning buoys have pushed the wave back forever. But the sea is not malicious, nor is it fooled. It knows the coastline is temporary, that harbors shift, that cities, no matter how grand, are only guests. And so it waits, not with vengeance, but with memory. We look at Akrotiri and see time paused, beds unmade, jars half filled, murals bright as if still wet. But the people are gone, no bodies, no skeletons, just absence. And in that absence, the sea speaks softly, not of where they went, but that they were. That life, ordinary and beautiful, unfolded here, and that it ended not with explanation, but with motion. Every disaster is a kind of remembering, a moment when nature reminds us that permanence is borrowed. The Minoans were not careless. They were not doomed. They were human. And the sea they trusted remembered something older, the shape of the earth before their time, the rhythm of collapse and renewal. In reverence, we return to that memory, not to fear it, but to honor it, to learn not just about ash or fault lines, but about how civilizations balance against nature's vast indifference. How belief and beauty and order can be swept away and still matter, still be worthy of memory. Because when the sea remembers, it does not do so with cruelty. It does so with gravity. The wave came and it passed, but its shape lives on in craters filled with sapphire water, in coastlines subtly altered, in myths half remembered. In Atlantis, in drowned temples, in the hush of certain islands that carry stories without needing to speak. That is how the sea remembers, not with detail, but with presence, a knowing that never leaves. And so we end not with tragedy, but with quiet awe. We sit beside the water, listening. We breathe, aware that all we build may one day lie beneath this same tide. And yet we build anyway. We live. We carve meaning into our days, paint our walls, name our gods. Like the Minoans, we trust the sea, not because it is safe, but because it cradles our past and perhaps holds space for our future. The sea remembers what we forget, and in that remembering, we find not fear, but belonging.